Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online. News that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Thank you for joining us for Newsmakers. I'm Casey Counts. The borderland has been a national topic of conversation due to increasing numbers of asylum seekers trying to make their case in the United States. Local resources have been strained, and immigration reform seems as elusive as ever. One of the organizations that aids the migrant population is Catholic Charities of Southern New Mexico. Its executive director, Ken Ferrone, is our guest today. And KRWG multimedia journalist Johnny Coker visited Mr. Ferrone and the border to help us understand this complex problem.
The influx of migrants over the past months has strained the resources of nonprofit organizations, including Catholic Charities of Southern New Mexico. The organization assists refugees and asylum seekers, but in terms of the current crisis at the border, they are seeing a rise of migrants in need. Ken Ferrone is the executive director of Catholic Charities of Southern New Mexico. The organization has a legal service program that provides support for refugees and asylum seekers.
We are here to serve the poor, and we don't discriminate against anyone, and we don't ask people what church or religion they are. We just say, how can we help you? And so we don't ask people about their immigration status. We do research with them. We find out if there is relief opportunities. If there is no relief opportunities, we will ask them to turn themselves into Border Patrol. And some of them, we've actually encouraged clients to go back to their home countries because they don't have any relief whatsoever.
Ferrone said that to ease the suffering at the border and in border communities, legislative change on a national level is needed.
The challenges we've been facing is that there has been no systematic or comprehensive legal immigration reform in this country. It's the responsibility of the Congress to do that. And unfortunately, whether there's a Republican Congress or a Democratic Congress, there's been no immigration reform for over 20, 30 years.
New Mexico Senator Ben Ray Lujan visited Las Cruces recently. He said that he was happy to see President Biden visit El Paso, but stressed that there is much legislative work to be done at the border.
It was important for President Biden to visit the border and to come and talk with personnel, as well as the conversations that have taken place in Mexico with the president from Mexico and Canada about challenges that we face as the Americas as well. More must be done to solve challenges within immigration reform. Comprehensive immigration reform is absolutely needed. There must be a way for us to find compromise and to have strong reform that is humane, that is strong, and that reflects the needs all across America and in our communities as well. Whether we're looking at increasing and strengthening security at our southern border, whether it's those initiatives or others, they must all be put on the table so that we can find further solutions as well. But the president's visit was very important, and I'm glad he came.
Ferrone said that when partisan politics stop progress, the vulnerable population of migrants are the ones who suffer the most.
In this country, it seems to be more of a political issue, and that's very unfortunate because these poor asylum seekers and people seeking a better life for themselves and their children are caught in the middle. And that's a situation that we deal with every day.
Ferrone said that even though there's been a large influx of migrants seeking help at the organization, they won't turn anybody away. For KRWG Public Media, I'm Johnny Coker.
Mr. Ferrone, welcome to KRWG Public Media.
Casey, thank you for having me on the show.
I think one of the things that stands out when we watch that story is the number of files that are behind you when you're sitting at your desk. What do those files represent?
Those files represent information from our clients. We are a full legal service provider, and we service the 10 southern counties of the state of New Mexico. We have an office in Roswell and one in Las Cruces. Those files behind me represent our clientele who we help with their legal adjustments, their status, all their immigration papers. So it's very important files that we have there.
As you see that image, it looks like it can be a little overwhelming, and I'm sure it can be. And we'll get down to kind of delving into some of those individual files toward the end of the program. But first I want to start with the migration issue from a macro perspective. And you can explain how it really is a global issue.
It is. In looking at the statistics from the United Nations, there was about 281 million migrants in the year 2020. And that was up from, I think, 190 million 10 or 30 years ago. So this is a worldwide phenomenon. People are moving. We have what I call corridors. We have the corridor where people are moving from Africa up into Europe, people leaving, for instance, places like Syria, Iran. And then we have the Americas, where the people are moving from Central and Latin America up into the United States. And so there has been tremendous surges of migrants flowing here in the past, and we're seeing a real influx now. There's really been a crisis on the border, partly because of the restrictions lifted once COVID has eased up. And so that's why we're seeing so many people come to the border of late.
Obviously, Title 42 at the center of that issue. And as we still kind of debate what the future of that is, obviously that's a difficult thing for people to go through who are waiting. I know a lot of them get misinformation as well. How pervasive a problem is that?
It is. Many of the immigrants, they do have phones, they're on WhatsApp, they're on social media, so they have a sense of what to expect, and they are on top of the news. So there was a surge here because there was a feeling or thought that Title 42 would be rescinded, and of course it hasn't been. So a lot of these immigrants are in limbo. Many of them are stuck in Juarez waiting to come across the border. Some of them that have come across the border actually get returned to Juarez because of Title 42.
And as a result, I know that there has been a sense, at least from some of the officials in El Paso, have said that they really don't trust anyone. And so it's even been hard to get them to go into shelters. What's your experience with those folks? Do you find them to be trusting once they get to the stage where they're with you?
That's a good question. Some of them, they've made 3,000-mile journeys on foot. And you think about that in itself. So when they get to the United States, they are relieved, but they're also anxious because many of them are here without papers, undocumented. So we have found people that have been just grateful to make it here, and we've heard harrowing stories. But there is a great deal of mistrust. There are individuals that they've just been traumatized. We were involved years back with the separation of families. Unfortunately, children were separated from their parents, and so that created a tremendous amount of trauma, and that information did make it back to home countries. So when they come up here, many of them are afraid to go to shelters or to go to Border Patrol because they're afraid of having their children separated from them.
We're going to talk in a little bit about the topic of legislation in this country, but first I want to talk about the root causes and the reasons that people are migrating, because it really does seem like no matter what our laws are, nothing's going to change the conditions where people are fleeing. So tell us a little bit about what you know about that.
Sure. There's many reasons why people are fleeing their home countries. There's obviously poverty. There's also, unfortunately, repressive regimes that are abusing and torturing people. There is a lot of gangs that do extortion work. For instance, we come across a lot of families that, their children are targeted by gangs and want to recruit them, and families have to make critical decisions about, do we stay and lose our child, or do we move north? There's also climate change. We interact with a lot of migrants that had little farms that were supporting themselves, and the climate has changed and there's no more rain, and so they can't support themselves and they have to move north. So there's many reasons, but most of the folks that we interact with are being pushed here, not pulled here. And they're being pushed because of economic situations, repressive regimes, and so it's sad that they're moving, they're traveling thousands of miles with children, and they're looking for a better life for themselves and their children.
When you consider climate change, and we don't necessarily know as individuals what to expect over the next 10, 20, 30 years, but most of the scientists tell us it's not looking great.
Right.
And I think we might be seeing just the tip of the iceberg in terms of migration due to climate change. How do you think we need to be preparing for that now?
Well, I think that we need to have more comprehensive immigration reform. That's one of the things that we've been challenged with in the work that we do along the border here. There really hasn't been any comprehensive immigration reform since 1965 in the Lyndon Johnson administration. There's been some little bit of changes, and they've probably come through executive orders through presidents. But if we're going to see this influx of refugees, which we know is going to continue to happen, we really need a humane and common sense immigration reform so that we can decide what we're going to do as a country, who are we going to be to accept these folks.
What do you think that should look like?
That's a really good question. I know if I had that answer, I'd probably be elected official, but I'm not, and I'm not running for office. I think that there's two groups of people. There's the refugees that are seeking asylum because of just terrible regimes that are torturing people and doing terrible, inhumane things. Those are people we should really, as a country, think about seriously taking them in and giving them shelter. I've always think about the situation or the story back in 1939, the ship to St. Louis, who had 900 immigrants, refugees coming from Europe. They were denied entry into Cuba, denied entry into this country, and were forced back to Germany. And sadly, out of the 900, about a third of those people perished in concentration camps. So when you think about the importance of the asylum program, people look to the United States for that freedom, for that safety. So those people, I think we just need to do the right thing and help them and bring them in. The other group that we deal with a lot is economic refugees. These are people that are in poverty, that want to better their lives, especially for their children. Those folks, we need a comprehensive immigration reform package that maybe is tied to our unemployment rate. When the unemployment rate is very high, maybe we don't allow as many refugees in or immigrants in. If the unemployment rate is very low, maybe we let more in. Just for instance, we've hired someone just this last week. We have had problems finding employees for our agency. The labor market's very tight. We have people that are traveling thousands of miles to come here for freedom, for better economic opportunities. I wouldn't mind hiring those people because I can't find people right now. Now, of course, we don't hire anyone who's not documented and is eligible to work in this country. But my point is, if they're motivated to travel that kind of distance with their families, these are people we want in this country. These are people that are hard workers that want to work and help us.
Do you think that we're missing an opportunity for economic benefits to fight inflation by not bringing in more immigrants and allowing them to get to work sooner rather than later?
Sure, that's a great question. Particularly for us here in the borderland, we rely on seasonal farm workers to do a lot of our harvesting, and they also work in hospitality industry. They work construction. We're starting to see what I call this silver tsunami. There's the older generations, the aging of our population. If we don't bring immigrants in and basically be able to have them work jobs and buy houses and have their own families, we're going to suffer. This country will suffer. Places like Canada and Australia have very good immigration policies, and so they are addressing these type of issues when they're realizing that their populations are aging. What are they going to do? And so,
in the video that we opened with that Johnny Coker produced, we saw Senator Ben-Ray Lujan making a visit. So when you get the opportunity to show New Mexico's congressional delegation what kind of work you're doing, what is their response, and what information are they taking, and what do you think they're doing with it?
Well, that's a good question. Whether we have Republican or Democratic legislatures and control of the White House, immigration reform has been something that's gotten away from us. We just haven't been able to do it. The political will doesn't seem to be there. And so when we talk to our elected representatives, we tell them we're a faith-based organization and we're looking for humane, common sense immigration reform so that people that are coming here, either fleeing violence or poverty, can find a place in our country and do well. It's personal for me. My family immigrated to this country from Europe back in the 19th century, and we've done well here, and we are a nation of immigrants, and my family immigrated here. So when we talk to elected officials, we basically focus on the benefits that immigrants bring to this country. For instance, many of the companies in Silicon Valley were founded by immigrants. There are probably about 50 million immigrants in this country, foreign-born people. So when people say, oh, they're flooding the borders, they're coming here, the reality is they're already here. And immigrants bring so much to our society. For instance, Steve Jobs, his family, his parents, they were from Syria. They think about the changes that were made through the iPhone and Apple. His family, they were immigrants from Syria. So we basically talk to our elected officials and the public and say, immigrants are an important fabric to our society and our country, and we should embrace them.
I read a statistic recently that immigrants are twice as likely than natural-born U.S. citizens to become entrepreneurs.
That's absolutely right. Many of the clients that we work with, for instance, young mothers, they have home cleaning businesses, they do all sorts of things, sewing businesses. They're very entrepreneurial, and we want those type of people in our country because they're creating jobs, and that's important.
What misconceptions do you think Americans have when it comes to migrants at our border?
I think that people feel that the migrants are coming here and they're looking for handouts, and I think that's, in our experience, not the case. We find people that come here that are looking for a better life, they're looking for jobs, they're looking to have their kids go to school, they're looking for better lives for their children. I think many people feel that the immigrants are getting free public benefits or, for instance, free medical care. The reality is that's not the case. Hospitals are obliged to take in people in emergency rooms in emergency situations, but some of the immigrants that we help out, we have to come up with donations to be able to help them with long-term medical issues they have. So they're not entitled to public benefits. And so I think there's a misconception that they're also taking jobs. We don't really see that in the case. Many of the people that we work with, they have jobs. We work with a lot of DACAs, children that came here at a very, very young age, that parents were undocumented but are now here working in basically the medical field. They're out there, they were on the front lines during COVID. So we just want to say there's a positive thing that immigrants are bringing here. It's not a zero-sum game like an immigrant's here and I lose a job, or that. It's not usually the case. A
report recently that was pretty widely circulated indicated that hotels are not cleaning rooms every day, and they're looking for automated ways to do that. Right. And at the risk of sounding stereotypical, it might seem that those are some of the jobs that new immigrants to the country might fill.
That's right. We see a lot of our clients that work construction jobs. They work in the hospitality industry. They work in the agricultural sector. I mean, it's been sad. Some of the, we've talked to farmers where they can't harvest their crops because there's not enough people out to pick the crops. And so this is important to our region and to the country.
And I'm glad you brought up DACA recipients because this is something that's been hanging out there for many years now.
Right.
What do you predict will happen with DACA recipients? Do you have any sense for whether we're going to make progress on their status?
That is a very good question. We thought that DACA was going to be fully implemented and in a good situation, except there was a judge in Texas that stopped everything. And so it's still up in the air. I think that we've been trying to emphasize the things that the DACA recipients can do and have been doing. Some of these individuals, they are, for all intents and purposes, Americans. They've been here since very young ages. Some of them don't even speak Spanish. And so we're hopeful that with some sort of immigration reform, that the DACAs will be given some sort of priority because we want them to be here, we want them to stay here. Many of the families we work with are we call mixed status families. So, for instance, the children are U.S. citizens and the parents are undocumented. Many of the undocumented parents cannot find work, so the DACA recipients are actually not only supporting themselves, but their parents and their families. So it would be a tremendous tragedy if the DACA program was discontinued and these individuals had to go back to their home countries.
We've talked a lot about federal inaction, but obviously federalism is at work on this issue from a local level to a state level as well.
Sure.
How has the state of New Mexico played a role in this issue?
Sure. We're a small nonprofit. We have, I think, 12 employees, an office in Roswell, office in Las Cruces. We really firmly believe in what I call cross-sectoral problem solving. We know that these problems that we're dealing with, like immigration and homelessness, they're very complex. And so it requires business, nonprofits, and government to come together to help solve these complex problems. And so we have really been fortunate here, especially in Las Cruces, very generous and giving town. We have our friends at Community of Hope. We have our friends at Border Servant Corps, the Community Foundation of Southern New Mexico. We've come together with local government here, the city of Las Cruces, and NGOs and businesses to sort of try and solve some of these problems. And I'm proud to say that during COVID, we gave away about $500,000 in direct assistance for people in need of utility assistance, rent, medical assistance through our partnership with the city of Las Cruces. So there is good things happening here in our community when these sectors come together and work together. At higher levels, at the state level, at the federal level, we just see so much partisanship. There's so much, I mean, they're using immigration in many ways to fundraise, to get votes. And it's really sad because these immigrants, these refugees, are sort of caught in between. They're almost like it's like a political hot potato. And so there's an election next year, so we don't know if there's going to be any immigration reform in the foreseeable future, but we hope there will be. You have divided Congresses, and you just don't see, other than executive orders, anything happening with immigration.
Compare what happens in New Mexico versus what happens in Texas and Governor Abbott's approach with Operation Lone Star.
Sure. Texas has been very aggressive in basically stopping people from coming across the border. In fact, I understand that they're now starting again to build the wall in Texas. You know, I don't want to be facetious, but if you build a 20-foot wall, there's going to be people who find a 21-foot ladder. People are going to come, and they've been coming for decades. And so we just would like Texas, Governor Abbott, to be a little more humane. Some of the things that were being done, stopping people across the border and even trucks and commerce, were impacting Texas and their economy to the point where it benefited Santa Teresa, because we had many companies and trucks coming through the Mexico ports of entry. So I don't know if it's something that, I mean, he's been busing people to places like New York and Washington, D.C. I mean, that to us is inhumane. I mean, you don't just have these people played out as pawns. So we would hope that there is a national immigration reform, and Texas could be part of that.
I think it's worth noting that migrants are bused to many other cities,
right,
because it's where they want to go.
Right.
We saw a couple of examples where they were taken to Martha's Vineyard, even the vice president's home. And so you have those examples that really stand out. But it's important for people to know that in the city of El Paso, migrants are regularly bused into other communities.
That's true.
To meet up with their families. There was a lot of pressure on the Biden administration to come to the border to visit.
Sure.
He made a very short stop. What value do you think that kind of visit has?
Well, I think it certainly, he should have been here, in my opinion, a little bit sooner. I mean, it took him about 2 years to get here. We work closely with Representative Escobar, and she's wonderful in the things that she does. But I think it does elevate the level of, yes, immigration is a problem. There needs to be a solution. Congress has kicked this can down the road for so long. Something needs to happen. So having the president here, and then he went to Mexico to meet with the Canadian Prime Minister and the President of Mexico to discuss. This is basically a hemispheric issue. This is not just a United States issue. So I'm a little bit optimistic about how things will go, because I think there's a realization, particularly in Canada, they have a very good immigration policy. They do really well, something we could probably learn from.
Can you tell us what that looks like? You know, maybe give an example of what you think Canada's doing so well?
I think they are certainly, as the United States, is very good about taking in refugees that have experienced trauma and from fleeing from repressive governments. They've also really focused on bringing in high-skilled, educated immigrants to help their economy, because their nation, like the United States, their population is aging. So I think they've done a very good job of being very strategic in who they bring in to their country. I think we could do the same thing, and we could learn from Canada. I think Australia also has a good immigration policy reform. But here we are, America, one of the greatest and probably not the best nation in the world. We don't have an immigration policy and reforms here that we need to have. And so it's just been disappointing for us.
Can you crystallize the local impact of these surges for our region?
Sure. So what we've seen is El Paso has been the highest border point entry for immigrants in the past 3 months of the whole nation. That surpasses Tijuana, San Diego. What typically happens is the migrants will start getting together in the Central American countries for their trek here. It takes them about 3 months. So what we're probably going to see is another influx of refugees come the spring, and it usually happens every spring. So not only did you see a surge here in the winter months because of the Title 42, thinking that it was going to be rescinded, but you're going to see another influx in the spring. So what we'd like to do is try and figure out what to do to address that surge. The nice thing is, and I mentioned this about our community is very generous and very giving and very compassionate. So we work in partnership with a lot of nonprofits here in town, with the city of Las Cruces, with business partners. We have a board of directors that we get advice from and counsel from, and they're in the business community. We need to be prepared for the next surge that's coming. I don't know, we just seem like we can't wait for the Congress to take action. So maybe it's just we have to take things in our own hand and be as compassionate as possible. We have the resources here in the border to do it. It's places like New York and Chicago, when folks get shipped there, they don't have the resources. So I sort of question why some of the border governors are doing this, because we do have the resources here.
You mentioned resources. What is it that your organization depends on in order to get the job done?
Well, we depend on basically donations. We basically get donations from foundations, individuals. We do, in partnership with the city of Las Cruces, through the Telsure Fund, we support victims of domestic violence. We have a partnership with La Casa. We're going to receive a large grant through the ARPA program, and we're going to be using that to help with community health issues and supporting individuals that have been impacted by COVID that need rent assistance, utility assistance. So what we rely on is donations, volunteers, and also we ask people, lobby your local elected officials and tell them we need immigration reform. This is a problem that's not going to go away, and we can't just be inactive about this or kick the can down the road. So I ask people, vote, lobby your elected officials. If you can donate, if you can volunteer, that's wonderful. And so that's what we need. It's a lot, but that's what we need.
It's a big issue and a lot to take in.
Sure.
Ken Ferrone, Executive Director of Catholic Charities of Southern New Mexico, thank you so much for your perspective.
Thank you so much for having me, Casey.
And that's our time for now. Join us this week on KRWG Radio. Every weekday, it's Morning Edition from 5 to 9, Fresh Air at 11, followed by Here and Now from noon to 2, and All Things Considered 4 to 7. KRWG News is always online at krwg.org, and we'd like to hear from you. Email us with story ideas and video submissions. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu. For all of us at KRWG News, I'm Casey Counts. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time on Newsmakers.